At 26, I thought I had a pretty good radar for people. I had dated enough to know the red flags, the charming facade that crumbled under pressure. But when I met Thomas, my radar went silent. After years of searching, he felt like the real deal. He was 28, handsome, driven, and possessed that rare, quiet intelligence that drew you in. Everything felt easy, effortless. Our conversations flowed, our ambitions aligned, and after 7 weeks, I believed I was standing at the threshold of something serious. Something lasting. 7 weeks is barely a flicker in the grand scheme of a relationship. But in that short time, Thomas had managed to dismantle my defenses. He was consistently sweet, thoughtful, remembering the small details that matter. He carried an air of successful professionalism, yet was always present and attentive when we were together. He had the polish of a man who knew what he wanted and treated people well. Or so I thought. The invitation came with a beautiful sense of occasion. It was for his 29th birthday weekend, a long celebration at his father's country house in a small, idyllic French town. This wasn't just another date. This was meeting the inner circle. His father, a smart and kind man whom Thomas spoke of with immense respect, would be there. And 2 of his closest, oldest friends, Alex and Bart, would join us. I remember the excitement that weekend generated. I bought a new dress, meticulously packed, and prepared myself for the critical assessment of his family and friends. This felt like the moment the casual, dating phase ended, and the relationship began. I saw this weekend as a quiet affirmation of our future. It was going to be a perfect, romantic chapter, a confirmation that Thomas was exactly who he presented himself to be. The drive was lovely, the French countryside unfolding in peaceful greens and golds. The country house itself was charming, and David's father, a man of gentle eyes and warm hospitality, immediately made me feel welcome. Day 1, Friday, was spent exploring the quaint town, sharing easy laughter, and simply enjoying the relaxed, familial atmosphere. Thomas was attentive, proud to introduce me. And even his friends, Alex and Bart, seemed decent enough, a little boisterous, perhaps, but friendly. I went to sleep that Friday night feeling completely secure, convinced I had found a rare thing, a man whose outward presentation matched his internal character. I thought, this is it. This is how the good stories start, but the good stories don't always start with sunshine. Sometimes, they start with a flickering firelight and a cruel, careless confession. The weekend was designed to be a celebration of Thomas's past and future. It ended up being an utter condemnation of his past, and a complete, final shutdown of any future we might have had. The stage was set for a gentle bonding weekend, but what I received was a front-row seat to the casual cruelty hidden beneath his charming smile. The perfection of the weekend was a facade, and soon, the first layer of paint would start to crack, revealing the rot underneath. Saturday began beautifully. It was a sun-drenched day typical of the French countryside. We spent the morning walking, sharing coffee, and the effortless conversations that had defined our 7 weeks continued. I felt completely comfortable around his father, who seemed genuinely pleased with Thomas's choice. Everything was confirming my initial assessment. Thomas was kind, successful, and came from a good, moral background. The afternoon led into the main event, a garden party. The neighbors were invited, including a few more of Thomas's local friends. The mood was festive, fueled by good food, flowing wine, and the general happiness surrounding a birthday celebration. I watched Thomas effortlessly navigate the gathering, a relaxed host, charming everyone he spoke to. I felt a surge of pride, thinking, this is my man. This is our life. As evening fell, the atmosphere grew cozier and significantly looser. People drifted towards a small campfire pit in the corner of the garden. The conversation, naturally, turned inward, to shared history, high school antics, and childhood memories. This is where the evening took its insidious, irreversible turn. At first, it was exactly what you'd expect: innocent pranks, dumb mistakes, the usual nostalgic humor of adult men reminiscing about their youth. We all laughed at stories of skipped classes and minor mishaps. I felt included, part of the inner circle, listening to these comfortable, trivial details that cement lifelong friendships. Then, Thomas and his friends, Alex and Bart, took center stage. I noticed their body language change. They leaned in, their voices dropping into a conspiratorial, excited tone. There was a dangerous glint in their eyes that I hadn't seen before. The alcohol had peeled away the layers of professional polish, revealing something darker, something deeply rooted in their shared past. They started recounting a story that, initially, sounded like a dark, slightly uncomfortable prank. But as the details unfolded, my internal alarm bells didn't just ring, they began to scream. The story was about a boy named Arthur, a shy, isolated classmate whom they found very amusing to target when they were 14 or 15. It began innocently enough, name-calling, mean jokes, the kind of terrible, typical bullying that scars a teenager. But they didn't stop there. Their description of their actions escalated from casual cruelty to something genuinely sick and premeditated. They weren't just retelling a childish prank. They were reliving, with palpable glee, a sustained act of malicious psychological torture. The comfortable warmth of the campfire instantly turned into a cold, horrifying spotlight on the moral void within these men. My heart, which had been so full of hope just hours before, began to constrict with dread, recognizing that the man I thought I knew was nothing more than a carefully crafted lie. The celebration was about to become a devastating condemnation. I sat frozen as Thomas, Alex, and Bart began to share the sickening details of the Arthur story. The atmosphere around the campfire shifted from shared nostalgia to something deeply predatory. They spoke with a horrifying lack of remorse, treating this prolonged act of destruction as if it were a hilarious anecdote from their mischievous youth. The core of the cruelty lay in their method. They didn't just call him names. They created a fake girl's profile on MSN Messenger, the primary social platform of that era. They chose the name and the persona carefully, using real photos of Bart's innocent cousin to lend credibility. For months, the three of them, Thomas being a key, active participant, took turns logging into this fake account, flirting with Arthur, building a false, intimate relationship with a boy they knew was lonely and desperately seeking connection. My stomach churned as Thomas described the meticulousness of their deception. They exchanged messages daily, listening to his confessions, his vulnerable dreams, his developing feelings for this online girlfriend. They shared his love messages and his deepest secrets amongst their circle of friends at school, turning Arthur's sincere affection into a sick and viral joke behind his back. The poor boy truly believed he had found someone. He invested his heart and soul into this connection, a connection these three men fabricated for their own malicious entertainment. As if the psychological torment wasn't enough, they recounted the final, devastating climax of their joke. When they finally got bored, they didn't just ghost him. They scheduled a false in-person rendezvous. They convinced Arthur to take a long bus ride, 2 or 3 hours away from home, to meet this girlfriend. And they specified what he should wear, an Elmer the Elephant t-shirt. A detail based on some private, cruel joke of theirs. They described the anticipation of their school friends. The dark humor of knowing Arthur would be waiting, utterly alone, believing this was the moment his virtual relationship became real. Obviously, no one was there. Thomas and Bart didn't know exactly how long Arthur waited, but they laughed at the sheer humiliation of the boy, stranded and waiting in that specific, ridiculous shirt. The final blow came the next day at school. They couldn't keep the secret. Thomas and Bart proudly told the whole story to everyone, circulating Arthur's desperate love messages and confessions. The result was exactly what they intended: absolute, public humiliation. Arthur stopped coming to class almost immediately. He later changed schools. The implications were obvious. This wasn't a harmless prank. It was an act of psychological violence that caused a vulnerable teenager to abandon his education and change his life entirely. It was an act of deliberate destruction, and sitting there, watching Thomas, the man I had started to fall for, recount this story, his face alight with laughter, my horror solidified into pure, cold contempt. He didn't just participate in the cruelty. He was proud of it. The sheer lack of remorse was the most terrifying part. As Thomas finished the anecdote, wiping a tear of laughter from his eye, he didn't offer a single word of regret. Alex and Bart were equally enthusiastic. They were adult men, professionals, yet they were celebrating the absolute moral failure of their teenage selves. Thomas, in particular, seemed to revel in the cleverness of their deception. He even added a chilling postscript, joking that they weren't evil enough to convince the boy to send sexually explicit messages. His words dripped with a casual, sickening disappointment that they hadn't pushed their victim further, hadn't inflicted deeper, more irreparable harm. It was the entitlement of a privileged bully who viewed another human being's vulnerability as merely a tool for their amusement. I sat there, utterly horrified. Every sweet word Thomas had ever spoken to me instantly turned to ash in my memory. The charming facade was gone, replaced by the ugly, unvarnished truth. This was a man who, at his core, lacked basic human empathy. He was capable of sustained, calculated cruelty, and he felt no shame about it, even years later, even in front of his new girlfriend. I was not the only one reacting. I noticed a figure standing slightly apart from the campfire, initially listening to the boisterous laughter. It was Thomas's father. He had arrived toward the end of the story, catching the punchline and Thomas's accompanying boast about not being evil enough. The look on his father's face was an absolute mirror of my own internal devastation, but amplified by paternal grief. It wasn't anger. It was the deepest form of disappointment. His eyes held a sadness so profound, a realization that the polished son he loved was, at his moral center, irrevocably flawed. Thomas, drunk and high on the thrill of his cruel nostalgia, didn't notice. He was too consumed by his own ego, basking in the approval of his equally callous friends. The air felt suffocating. I couldn't breathe the same air as these men, couldn't share another moment with the man who had just revealed the depths of his moral emptiness. I mumbled a vague excuse, something about being tired, and escaped the party immediately. The cheerful chatter of the gathering followed me back to the quiet, dark house. I didn't pack that night. I was too numb, too consumed by a furious, cold clarity. I lay in the dark, pretending to sleep, listening to the muffled sounds of the distant party, and then, around 4 a.m., the heavy, careless sounds of Thomas stumbling into bed next to me. He kissed me on the forehead, muttering a drunken, affectionate word, entirely unaware that he had just signed the death warrant of our relationship. I knew, with cold, absolute certainty, that I couldn't just leave a note. I couldn't send a quick text. Thomas deserved more than a simple goodbye. He deserved a lesson in consequence. He had played with another person's feelings for months for his own amusement. I would play with his feelings for a few hours, for the sake of justice. The entire night I lay awake, the memory of Arthur's humiliation and Thomas's arrogant laughter replaying relentlessly. The sheer scale of the betrayal wasn't against me, yet. It was a profound betrayal of human decency. But by hiding that rot beneath a charming facade and bringing me into his life, Thomas had effectively betrayed my judgment and my trust in him as a person. I had 7 weeks invested in Thomas, and there was genuine attachment there. He was sweet, smart, and handsome. That's why the shock was so potent. It wasn't easy to simply flip a switch and hate him. I had to consciously sever the attachment, reminding myself that the man I liked was merely a character played by a cruel actor. Day 3 was Sunday, Thomas's actual birthday. The original plan was elaborate and beautiful. I was supposed to take him on a surprise, intimate lunch date at a fancy restaurant nearby, followed by a larger party with the group in the late afternoon. The surprise date was my weapon. I realized I had a unique opportunity. Thomas had already demonstrated his method of cruelty, false hope, calculated deception, public humiliation. To deliver a proportional consequence, a small, necessary payback for Arthur, I had to use the same method, but focused entirely on the emotional cost. I woke up before dawn. I moved with a silent, surgical precision I didn't know I possessed. I gathered all my clothes, my toiletries, my suitcase. Not a sound. I left no note, no trace that I had planned to leave. I slipped out of the house and walked, quickly, quietly, to the small train station in the French town. I bought a ticket for the earliest direct train back to Paris. I had only been gone for an hour when I sat on the train, watching the beautiful, deceiving countryside rush past the window. Now came the execution of the plan. I had to ensure 2 things. 1, that Thomas spent his birthday feeling the exact kind of anticipation and subsequent devastating disappointment he had inflicted on Arthur. And 2, that the meaning of my actions was unmistakable. I waited until I knew he would be awake. Around 10 a.m., I sent the first text message. It was written with the same sweet, eager tone I had used all weekend. I wished him a happy birthday and told him to meet me at a specific location, a random, picturesque spot I found quickly on Google Maps, about an hour's drive from the country house. I explained that I needed a head start to ensure his surprise was perfect and asked him to follow the instructions religiously. I felt a cold, hard knot of justice tighten in my stomach. I was using his own excitement, his own sense of occasion, to draw him into the trap. The anticipation, the hope, I was meticulously building the scaffold for his emotional collapse. The revenge wasn't personal. It was principled. It was a small, focused act of retribution on behalf of the poor, forgotten boy named Arthur. Thomas received the text, and his response was immediate and filled with the kind of giddy excitement you'd expect on a birthday morning. He told me he was thrilled, that he loved my spontaneous spirit, and that he would follow my instructions, to the letter. His compliance was total. He drove an hour from his father's house to the first designated spot. I imagined him, likely still hungover, but energized by the promise of a fancy date and a big birthday surprise. He was probably whistling, thinking about how lucky he was. He arrived at the first location at 12:30 p.m. He texted me, confirming he was there and asking where he should park. This was the first pull of the string. I texted back immediately, "There's a tiny, unexpected delay with the surprise setup. It's a very intricate plan. Stay put for a moment, and I'll send you the next clue in 30 minutes. Don't worry, you'll understand why I made you wait when you see it." Now Thomas was waiting. Alone. Anticipating. I used the 30 minutes to find the next location. A high-end restaurant about a 30-minute drive from the first spot. The key was to keep him driving, keep him moving, keep him invested in the false hope of the surprise. I wanted the anticipation to build into a fever pitch of excitement, which would make the eventual fall so much further. At 1 p.m., I sent the second instruction. I told him to drive to this specific restaurant, emphasizing that I wanted the meal to be perfect. I asked him to walk inside, tell the host he was meeting his gorgeous girlfriend for his birthday, and secure a great table. And then, the critical detail, order the most expensive bottle of champagne on the menu. I'm arriving in 20 minutes. Don't worry, darling, I'll pay for everything. This instruction was designed to elevate the emotional stakes and ensure his commitment. By ordering the champagne, he was publicly confirming his anticipation, confirming the surprise, confirming his hope. He was placing his trust entirely in my promise. He arrived at the restaurant at 1:30 p.m., the anticipation now buzzing with the energy of a public scene. He was sitting there, likely already sipping the expensive champagne, waiting for his girlfriend to arrive and complete his perfect birthday. I let the clock tick. 1:35 p.m. 1:40 p.m. 1:45 p.m. The silence from me was deliberate. It was the moment he started to suspect. At 1:45 p.m., the call started. They weren't casual. They were worried, insistent, and demanding answers. Thomas was losing his composure. He texted me repeatedly, "Where are you? Is everything okay? What is the holdup? I'm sitting here with the champagne." I watched the clock tick down, feeling the cold, clinical satisfaction of a plan well executed. The initial joy was curdling into anxiety. Just as Arthur's excitement must have slowly turned to dread that day by the bus stop. I waited until 1:50 p.m. He had been sitting alone, waiting for the promise to materialize, for 50 minutes. He had made himself vulnerable in front of a fancy restaurant, with an expensive bottle of champagne, all for a date that would never happen. The emotional investment was maximized. I ignored his last call and composed the final, perfect text. I wrote it in French, using a tone of cold, decisive finality. The words were simple, yet devastating, a direct echo of the cruelty he had inflicted 17 years ago. "So, how does it feel to have people play with your feelings?" That was it. I hit send and I imagined the moment he read it. The instant, sickening realization that the loving surprise date was nothing more than a meticulously designed trap. The sweet girlfriend he thought he had found was, in reality, the instrument of his justice. The shame, the humiliation, the devastating realization that he was sitting alone, betrayed, at the most expensive table in the restaurant, all because of a lie. I stopped responding entirely. The calls kept coming, a frantic succession of unknown numbers, blocked numbers, texts filling my inbox. He tried pleading, apologizing, demanding an explanation. He was desperate to regain control of the narrative, to understand why. I let him call. I let him text. He was now experiencing a fraction of the sustained, calculated psychological pain he and his friends inflicted on Arthur. It wasn't about the hour. It was about the shock of betrayal delivered at the moment of peak hope. Later that afternoon, an unknown number managed to break through. It was his friend, Alex, the accomplice from the campfire story. Alex was frantic, angry, demanding I explain myself and complaining that I had completely ruined Thomas's birthday. This was my final opportunity to deliver the message. The explicit moral context that transcended mere breakup drama. I responded calmly, my voice flat. Holding nothing back, "This is an extremely small payback for what you did to Arthur. Tell Thomas to stop calling me." Then, I hung up. I immediately blocked Alex's number, and every other number associated with Thomas and his friends. My action was complete. I had delivered the consequence, clarified the motive, and secured my escape. My time as Thomas's girlfriend, my time as the oblivious victim, was over. I was now the unwavering judge who executed the sentence. I spent the rest of Sunday evening alone in my Paris apartment, and the feeling was not triumphant. It was a strange, heavy mixture of cold satisfaction and deep, residual sadness. I knew I had done the right thing, the only thing, but the attachment I had felt for Thomas didn't simply vanish with a text message. I felt the profound loss of the future I thought I was building. I grieved for the man I thought Thomas was, mourning the potential that was so cruelly erased by the revelation of his character. It's hard to reconcile the charming, attentive boyfriend with the callous bully who laughed at psychological torture. But I had to remind myself that the latter was the truth. The silence from the blocked numbers was a strange comfort. But the silence from my wider social circle began to fill the void. A few days later, a mutual friend, Sarah, called me. She was angry and bewildered. She said my reaction was absurd, crazy, and unfair. She argued that it wasn't my role to punish someone for actions they committed as a teenager. That people change, and that there were adult ways of saying things. She confirmed that the birthday was, indeed, completely ruined, and that Thomas was devastated, confused, and asking everyone what had happened. Her words stung. Not because I doubted my action, but because it highlighted the difficulty of moral justice. Most people prefer simple narratives. My action was complex, rooted in a historical moral offense that most would choose to ignore or rationalize away. Sarah preferred to see me as the crazy bitch who ruined a birthday. Rather than acknowledging the deep-seated cruelty of the man she was defending, only a few people, my closest, most morally centered friends, supported me fully. They were the ones who understood that the issue wasn't the age of the crime, but the lack of remorse. The fact that Thomas still found it funny, still viewed Arthur's devastation as a punchline, proved the rot hadn't been excised. It had merely been covered up by a nice suit and a good job. I had to steel myself against the judgment. Every moment of guilt I felt, I countered with the image of teenage Arthur, sitting alone at the bus stop in his ridiculous shirt, his heart shattered by a calculated lie. My action was small, finite, and fleeting. His action was months-long psychological warfare. My conscience remained clear. I simply hoped that Thomas, in that moment of humiliation, was forced to feel a fraction of the shame he denied Arthur. Thomas tried to fix things. For several months, despite being blocked on my main channels, he found ways to reach out, secondary emails, letters, even sending flowers to my office. He wanted to talk things through, to explain, to win me back. I never responded. My silence was the final, definitive shutdown of any relationship. I spent considerable time reflecting on why this particular teenage offense provoked such a decisive, destructive response from me. Why not just walk away quietly? Why the calculated theatricality? The answer lay in the very nature of Thomas's crime. It wasn't a crime of passion or a sudden, momentary lapse in judgment. It was a crime of design. Thomas was an architect. His life was built on meticulous planning, structure, and execution. The crime against Arthur mirrored his professional skill set. They conceived a project, the fake girlfriend. They established the necessary infrastructure, the MSN profile. The photos, they gathered the required data, Arthur's confessions. And they executed a planned, devastating destruction, the fake rendezvous and public sharing, the fact that he remained unrepentant as an adult, and, in fact, proud of his efficiency and cruelty, meant that the core moral failure was not a youthful mistake. It was a fundamental character trait. It revealed a man capable of detached, sustained malice. One who views vulnerability as a weakness to be exploited, and human emotion as material to be manipulated for entertainment. If a man can spend months meticulously planning the emotional ruin of a lonely, defenseless teenager for a laugh, what is he capable of when the stakes are higher, when it involves business, finance, or a long-term marriage? I had seen the blueprint of his moral void. My refusal to engage in an adult conversation was itself a form of adult justice. A conversation would have allowed Thomas to minimize his actions, to manipulate my guilt, and to use his charm to rationalize the past. He would have apologized for the consequence, losing me, but not the crime, hurting Arthur. By using his own methodology against him, the false promise leading to devastating humiliation, I forced him to feel the raw emotional cost without giving him the stage to perform his apology. The small act of revenge on his birthday was not about settling a score for myself. It was about standing up for the principle that accountability does not expire. It was a tiny, focused act of retribution delivered on behalf of the poor, forgotten boy named Arthur. The years passed, and Thomas's attempts to contact me eventually ceased. The episode became a defining moment in my life, not because of the heartbreak, but because of the clarity it forced upon me. The judgment from my social circle eventually faded, replaced by grudging respect when they realized my decision was absolute and final. They saw that I had walked away from a man who was, on paper, a catch, all because of an unwavering moral line. The lesson I taught wasn't for Thomas. It was for myself, and for everyone who witnessed the breakup. I learned to trust my moral compass implicitly, even when it led me to unpopular or difficult decisions. The fear of being called crazy or a bitch paled in comparison to the horror of compromising my integrity by staying with a man I despised. When I started dating again, my vetting process was relentless. I looked past the initial charm and professional success. I sought evidence of empathy and humility. I looked for how men treated service staff, how they spoke about past conflicts, and whether they had the capacity to admit mistakes without rationalizing them away. The Thomas experience had equipped me with an almost forensic ability to detect a charming facade. I found lasting happiness with a man who is the antithesis of Thomas, quiet, genuinely kind, and whose moral character is the true foundation of his success. I shared the story of Thomas with him, and his reaction, one of immediate, quiet horror and complete understanding, confirmed my choice. The revenge, though small, had a profound ripple effect. It was a symbolic closure that allowed me to move on without bitterness. I had addressed the moral outrage, delivered the consequence, and walked away entirely clean. I had refused to allow cruelty to triumph. My only final wish, a wish I still hold, is for Arthur. He should be 35 or 36 now. I often hope that he is well, that he healed from the profound wound inflicted by those boys, and that he found the genuine love and connection he deserved. I hope he knows, somehow, that at least one person, years later, saw the injustice and fought back. What struck me most about Thomas wasn't the high school cruelty itself. Teenagers are often terrible, but his adult response. His reaction wasn't, "That was awful. I was an immature jerk." His reaction was, "It was funny, and I regret we didn't go further." This reveals a crucial element of the psychology of the unrepentant bully, pathological entitlement. Thomas believed the rules of morality did not apply to him. He was charming enough, smart enough, and wealthy enough to hide his moral void beneath a veneer of professional polish. The arrogance was so vast that he didn't even think to edit the story for his new girlfriend. He thought the audacity of the crime was a point of pride, something to be shared and celebrated. This entitlement is what made the calculated revenge so essential. He needed a direct, visceral lesson in what it felt like to have the structure of his happiness demolished by a lie, delivered by someone he trusted completely. The emotional shock of the betrayal was a necessary mirror, showing him the ugliness of his own actions, albeit on a much smaller scale. The shame, the public humiliation at the expensive restaurant, the ruined birthday, these consequences, though temporary, spoke a language he understood: status and control. By taking control of his celebratory moment and converting it into a moment of devastating personal failure, I temporarily stripped him of both. My action was an exercise in principled accountability. I wasn't waiting for Thomas to change. I wasn't negotiating. I was stating, definitively, that actions have consequences, regardless of how long ago they occurred, provided the lack of remorse remains current. His continuous laughter confirmed his present, adult moral character. The breakup wasn't about the past. It was about the present and the future I refused to share with a man capable of such sustained, cold-blooded cruelty. Many people, including my mutual friend, asked why I couldn't have just ended things quietly. Why the drama? Why the public show? Why couldn't I have just sent a text saying, "I can't be with a man who finds cruelty funny," and walked away? The answer is complex, but rooted in the realization that silence is complicity. If I had simply walked away, Thomas would have rationalized the breakup. He would have told his friends that I was too sensitive, that I didn't understand the humor, or that I was too high-strung. He would have escaped without ever truly connecting his celebration of Arthur's pain to his own loss. He would have successfully silenced the truth. The public nature of the final text, the fact that I had Alex on the phone, the fact that Thomas was waiting at a very visible, expensive restaurant, ensured the message was delivered, confirmed, and understood by his inner circle. When Alex called me demanding an explanation, I gave him the one, undeniable truth: "This is an extremely small payback for what you did to Arthur." That sentence was my true goal. It guaranteed that Thomas and his friends could never dismiss my action as the hysterical overreaction of a woman. It forced them to connect their present shame to their past crime. It put a name, Arthur, on their consequence. My small act of theatrical justice was necessary to break through the armor of their entitlement and their ingrained ability to rationalize away their sins. By speaking out, even in that small, focused way, I ensured that the memory of Arthur and the profound wrong committed against him would, for at least one birthday, cast a dark, inescapable shadow over Thomas's triumphant life. I refused to let the victim remain forgotten. And I refused to let the perpetrator remain comfortable. A breakup is often viewed as a mutual failure, a painful, messy negotiation of shared assets and lost potential. My breakup with Thomas was none of those things. It was an execution of moral judgment followed by an immediate, clean secession. The act of blocking him immediately and permanently wasn't petty. It was the establishment of a permanent moral boundary. I was not interested in hearing his excuses, his rationalizations, or his attempts at reconciliation. There was nothing to fix because the problem wasn't the relationship. The problem was his fundamental character. By refusing to engage in his emotional cleanup, I denied him the opportunity to use his charm to manipulate my guilt. The freedom I felt after those initial days of sadness was enormous. It was the freedom that comes from knowing you stood up for your deepest beliefs, even when the rest of the world called you crazy. I chose integrity over comfort. I chose justice over attachment. This story serves as a profound reminder that character is not built in moments of ease, but revealed in moments of challenge, and terrifyingly, often in moments of careless confession. Thomas revealed his true nature under the influence of alcohol and nostalgia. He showed me the kind of man he truly was, and I accepted his truth. The 7 weeks of happiness were a powerful delusion, but the 30 minutes of his birthday humiliation were absolute reality. I realized that the love I felt was for a phantom, and the necessary response was to destroy the illusion and reclaim my own clarity. My life continued, richer and more honest because of the strict moral code I was forced to enact. I was no longer afraid of confrontation. I was afraid of moral compromise. And that distinction changed everything. Years have passed now. I am happily married, building a future on a foundation of genuine trust. The story of Thomas is a quiet anecdote I share only when asked about the importance of character in a partner. It is my defining lesson. The man who taught me the most profound lesson about human character was not the charming boyfriend, but the forgotten victim, Arthur. His silent suffering, recounted with careless laughter by his tormentors, was the catalyst that saved me from a lifetime of moral compromise. I don't know where Thomas is now. I assume he is successful, perhaps married, his moral crime long forgotten by everyone but me, his father, and Arthur himself. But I hope that every year, on his birthday, when the texts and calls of well-wishers flood his phone, there is a momentary, uncomfortable pause, a fleeting memory of sitting alone at that restaurant, drinking expensive champagne, and receiving the devastating text that asked, "So, how does it feel to have people play with your feelings?" I didn't seek his destruction. I sought his accountability. And I received something far more valuable than revenge, unwavering self-respect. My story is a testament to the idea that some moral lines are not to be crossed. And some wounds do not heal simply with the passage of time. If the perpetrator still celebrates the cruelty, the moral debt remains current. I broke up with Thomas on his birthday not to be cruel, but to be just. And I have never regretted my choice. I simply hope that Arthur, who should be 35 or 36 years old now, is well. Choose your partners based on their character, not their charm. And never, ever compromise your moral code for the sake of comfort. That integrity is your greatest power.